All right, and we are live. So give me just 1 second to share this stream and we will begin with the discussion. Alrighty. Here we go. And let's double check Telegram to make sure people know. Okay, cool. Awesome. All right. All right, so let's go ahead and get into it after all the admin's done here. All right, so good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everybody around the world who are followers of my channel. Hello, Cyberpunk Eternal Affairs. Nice to see you. So today we're going to get into some weapons grade level autism on Ukraine. And just so everybody's aware, I've done a pretty significant deep dive into the numbers and, just the sheer staggering amount of equipment that Ukraine has been provided over the last 8 months. And my central premise here is that Ukraine is probably receiving a little more than there have been advertised. So there are several sources that I've been using. The first is like just straight up Wikipedia data, right? Wikipedia has a comprehensive list of everything that has been given to Ukraine so far, not just in terms of military hardware, but also in terms of um, other forms of aid like financial and humanitarian aid, etc. And that's really helpful because when you get into the brass tacks of it and you start talking about, okay, how much exactly is Ukraine able to fight logistically? I mean, how are they able to pay their people with their economy? I mean, they've gotten IMF loans and things like that, etc. But we're just going to focus primarily on the military side of this today. Um, so the other major source that we can use, which is kind of uh, in the same camp as ISW. They're very pro Ukraine, so everything that they have to say is taken with a grain of salt. Um, is Oryx, and Oryx is a really good source because they actually list pictures. So and they seem to update their stuff a lot, and other than their extremely really rabid pro-Ukrainian bias and everything having to be taken with extreme amounts of salt, they've been very good at documenting confirmed losses that have popped up on social media, and they've actually written a lot of articles on the aid to Ukraine. So that's something that has been helpful. And of course, the other one are the usual Russian Telegram and affiliated YouTube channels, right? Which are much better in terms of being able to um, not just see the actual combat footage, which isn't going to be shown anywhere on Twitter other than seeing another Russian T-72 get blown up. They actually have Ukrainians getting blown up. Um, the um, the other thing is hearing the sort of insider perspective from the Russian point of view, and of course, the sort of inner workings of Shoigu and like Sorovikin and their personalities and that sort of thing, which is helpful from the meme perspective, I guess, on what the stereotype of these figures are and how their command is going to go. So without further ado, I have with me Praise of Folly. So, sir, if you'd like to go ahead and shill, we can go ahead and get that out of the way.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for having me on, Raging. It's a pleasure. Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Locals. You can also subscribe to my YouTube channel. But as we all know, subscribing to a YouTube channel doesn't always mean you get notifications. Whereas if you subscribe to me on Twitter, Telegram, and Locals, you do. Also on Locals, you can support and engage the channel directly also, which you can't do on the other platforms.
Perfect. And so without further ado, let me see if I can go ahead and share my screen here so you can all see what I'm talking about. Okay. There we go. Okay, perfect. All right, so here we go. Let's go ahead and go to the Oryx site here. So they've kept a running tally on what social media losses the Russians have taken, like I said before. They are claiming that Russia has lost 7,500 armored vehicles, or rather vehicles of all type, I should say, not just the armored ones. So you can see, of course, 1,400 tanks, and let me scroll down so you can see all of these pictures here. They've said of the armored vehicles, 683. That doesn't mean anything. There's more than one variant of BMP, and then of course they got 1,600 of down here. They have them classified in a strange way, in my view, but just so we can kind of see the tally of losses here. All right, so the main point is the numbers here, right? All of these things, weapons, are mostly of ex-Soviet origin. Obviously, we've seen like plenty of combat footage of T-72s and T-62s getting blown up or captured. As we would expect from wartime propaganda, everybody's success is going to be maximized by the side which is putting out the information, and everybody's um, failures are going to be ignored or hand washed away somehow by the side putting out whatever information, right? So this is what Russia has been claimed to have lost from Oryx. This is, as far as I know, the most accurate number that I've seen floating around. And it's a very generous number, I think. And Praise, you've talked with me before on stream before on why I think this is generous. Um, do you want to kind of go into why we think that Oryx is a little reason for skepticism?
Yeah. So I don't remember. I think it was called the Purin. There was a YouTube channel that was analyzing this conflict from using Oryx stats. And what was suspicious was prior to the Ukraine conflict, this guy was like a video game streamer. And then all of a sudden, he just out of nowhere starts, doing all this geopolitics stuff in a certain perspective with a certain agenda. It's like, wait a minute, this is not what you were doing 2 years ago. Like if you were like a geopolitics channel for like, say, a geopolitics guy like Peter Zion for like the last 10 years, I wouldn't be surprised. That would be no surprise to me. But that was, and he wanted to debunk the idea that Russia wasn't sending its best. And he used Oryx stats for the destroyed vehicles. But he did something very suspicious and dodgy. He said that I am not going to include vehicles that are used by both Ukraine and Russia. And I'm like, well, that's convenient, isn't it? Because there's a lot of overlap in vehicles they used. And so like T-62s, T-70s, T-64s, T-72s, of various makes and models. All of those are used by both Ukraine and Russia. So the first question is, how many of these? I mean, look, all you'd have to do is if you're a Ukrainian, you could just have one of your knocked out tanks and then spray paint a Z on it and then take a photograph. You could do that, and I wouldn't put it past the Ukrainians to actually do that. In which case, what does that prove? And sometimes these pictures are, a lot of these will be hyperlinks to pictures of destroyed vehicles. Yes, but how do we know those aren't Ukrainians being destroyed? Because the Russians also have drones and missiles and all that stuff. It's just like, well, And if they use the same tanks, and you have this like eye in the sky picture that doesn't really show you all the details, it gets really confusing and suspicious as to like how many whose losses are these really? Are these Ukrainian losses or are these Russian losses? And I think that's actually a relevant question given that they have a lot of shared equipment. And the other thing is too, there's just not a lot to trust the Ukrainians on. Snake Island was a joke. We have footage of the garrison surrendering to the Russians and boarding on a transport vessel. Hardly the heroic suicide last stand we heard about. And the ghost of Kiev is the meme that keeps on giving, even though it never happened. So I'm very suspicious. There's a lot of reasons to be suspicious about this.
Absolutely. And the thing that I have always noticed in terms of like what they're claiming are Russian losses, right? Look at all these captured, right? Every single one of these is captured. You can, if you're, I'm still sharing the screen, so you can see captured, 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 all the way down, right? Um, so, like, if a Ukrainian soldier captures a T-62 or T-72 or whatever, that's from the Soviet era, Ukrainian service, and then the Russians kill it later. I mean, what exactly is that classified as? Is that counted as a Russian loss or as a Ukrainian loss? How can you even tell considering using the same equipment? It's so interchangeable. So the the older or the newer variants, I should say, of the T-72 or the T-80 or whatever, if they're captured, it really matter because you can't, unless it's something that's to Russia, you just can't tell, right? It just becomes very difficult. And even if you see a BMP or whatever get totally um, blown to smithereens, is completely on fire. I mean, how do you know what type it is? Some of these vehicle distinctions are very, very detail oriented. And if it's just some unknown random, BMP variant or whatever, it's very difficult to tell.
Yeah, no, I agree. And again, why not paint Z's on your own knocked out vehicles that you could then claim as a Russian loss? I mean, yeah, given the level of skullduggery that we've seen with Ukrainian propaganda, why would that not be something you'd do?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, just for reference, right? Russia has claimed, or Ukraine is basically claiming through Oryx that it's killed almost 7,500 Russian vehicles of all types. So that includes aircraft. That's everything, right? Let's go over to, let's see here. What I got over here on my screen, which this was shared on one of the Russian Telegram channels, right? They have an MOD release on what the Russian Ministry of Defense is claiming that they've killed. So they claim, and I'm going to read this statement out for everybody. In total, 325 airplanes, 162 helicopters, 2,326 UAVs, 386 anti aircraft missile systems, 6,020 tanks and other armored fighting vehicles, 874 combat vehicles equipped with MLRS systems, 3,521 field artillery cannons and mortars, as well as 6,741 units of special military hardware have been destroyed during the SMO. So that's a very interesting number right there. And if you compare that to what the Ukrainians have said, I mean, that's an incredible number. That's like almost, I think I did a calculation. It's somewhere between 2.5 to 3 to 1 losses, which is crazy. Um, if you just count that, right, just that alone, that's insane. They've
Yeah.
destroyed almost as, or the Russians are claiming that they've destroyed almost as many tanks as the Ukrainians have said have they've destroyed in all assets in total. So I find that very fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. See, it at the start of this conflict, everybody knew that when it came to actual hardware, the Ukraine was vastly outnumbered. Now, as far as actually mobilized and mobilizable people, Ukraine had the advantage. So, depending on which source you look at, Russia had between 150 to 200,000 troops ready to invade, and Ukraine had about 250,000 already in active duty, with another, I think, theoretical 500,000 in reserve. Now, obviously, all of that has not been mobilized, but some has been. Now, as to Russia's claims to have destroyed these Ukrainian assets, I'll say this, right? On the face of it, it's more plausible because, again, Ukraine lacks the hardware to inflict those kinds of losses. Russia, in theory, does. But the thing that is, if that is the case, and this is where I think this is my general rule of thumb. Okay, both the Western media and the Russian media are reporting on real events, so there's going to be some kernel of truth in whatever they're saying, to the extent that what they're describing is real world events. I think that the Russian media is generally more trustworthy than the Western media at this point, but both have reasons to fudge it a little bit for propaganda purposes. That's sort of my rubric for this. Um, while Russia does have the hardware theoretically to inflict these losses, that's difficult to then explain what went on around Kharkiv and what's going on around Kherson, because it sounds like Ukraine still has a bit of fight left in it, which would be a little harder to explain if those losses were as the Russians say they are.
Hmm. Right. And just with the Russian losses here, the one really grain of salt that I could think for their claim of a 3-to-1 kill ratio is they're actually have been fighting with one hand tied behind their back the whole time. So, okay, that's nice that you say that you've killed, whatever 6,000 Ukrainian tanks. 6,020 is what is the one that they listed today. But is that really accurate? Because you've invaded with 200 to 250,000 guys, and the Ukrainians have roughly that many people just from the start of the war when they went to general mobilization in the first week. So it's hard to gauge for that reason. I definitely think that Russia is slightly more trustworthy. I agree with you on that. However, there was another thing that I've seen on the Russian Telegram channels. Apparently, Shoigu, their defense minister, was talking about a month or two ago the amount of casualties that the Russians estimate that the Ukrainians have taken. And in that press release, I think he said that Ukraine had lost around 60,000 dead and around 40,000 wounded. And with the numbers that they're calculating here with their little press releases and the numbers I just showed you, that's about right. So, I mean, whatever metric they're using seems to at least some and the logic seems to be okay. We've killed a tank or an IFE that equals roughly 3 guys KIA, and that's pretty much seems to be the metric that I could just think of off the top of my head. And the number that I looked at makes complete sense, and that totally checks out when I ran the math for it based off of the assets that they've said they've killed. So what do you think about that?
I think that, again, so 60,000 killed, 40,000 wounded. That would be not quite half of what Ukraine started with. I think that's within the realm of the believable, because especially a couple months ago with the fighting around Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, when the Ukrainians were claiming, remember, this was claimed by a chief Ukrainian military official. They had 700 casualties a day, 200 dead and 500 wounded, due to the Russian artillery advantage of 10-1. So even the Western media couldn't hide how badly the Ukrainians were suffering in the Donbass. And That would again, Russia has the capabilities, the 10-to-1 artillery advantage, the advantage in aerial missile systems. So they both Russia and Ukraine use standoff missiles because if you fly over certain parts of airspace, you'll be shot down. So Russia will simple fire a missile from over the Black Sea because they're not going to fly over Ukrainian SAM site, and the Ukrainians will do the same. They'll fire a missile into the Black Sea from flying over Ukraine. But Russia has more of those as well, and so I would argue that it's plausible. Um, so I wouldn't have too much to say against it.
Hmm. Yeah. As a counter view, let's see if we can pull this up real quick. Where's that? Where's that 300,000? Hold on, I sent it to you. There we go. Okay. So there's this guy called Sprinter Monitor who was talking about irretrievable losses of the armed forces of Ukraine. And he was saying that as of October 20th, they had 402,000 people irretrievably lost, of which 387,000 were killed. And he said that's using OSINT data, reports from funeral agencies, morgues, etc., etc. What do you think about that figure?
Yeah, yeah. So if we look at the start of the war, both active duty and reserve troops, I think Ukraine was set for a total of 750,000. Uh, that would be over half. And I don't know how fast the general mobilization takes effect. I'm not even sure they've mobilized all the 500,000 potential reservists. So I find that to be a relatively high figure, one that I'd be suspicious of because I'm not. I mean, let's say they only mobilized 200,000 out of the total 500,000, then that would be almost all out of the active duty Ukrainians. But I don't think they've killed almost all of the active duty Ukrainians, and I also don't think they've, unless I'm mistaken, they've mobilized their entire population yet. I mean, general mobilization is it's going to take a while, so maybe a year, I would think. So I think it's a little high.
Sorry, you're roboting kind of hard there, Praise.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I said I think it's a little high because they would have had to kill over half of all Ukrainian active duty and reserve troops, and I'm not sure they've even mobilized all the reserves yet.
Yeah, and it's important to note that, like as I said, Ukraine went to general mobilization in the first week, and I definitely saw a lot of social media posts of random Ukrainian dudes being, hauled off a bus that was transiting to the Ukrainian border, um, and seeing, horrific, draft videos basically. Um, but the interesting thing is so Ukraine can draw upon a lot more manpower so long as it can equip them, right? And when you saw the videos and the footage like 6 months ago in Donetsk, or even in as late as July, you really didn't see a whole lot of equipment that was being given to Ukraine in terms of quality. Like you saw a lot of Ukrainian soldiers wearing like tennis shoes and things like that with their camouflage. And that's pretty significant because if you can't equip your soldiers, you can't have them fight for you. Um, Now, of course, it's a little different. You start to see much more video and pictorial footage of Ukrainian soldiers wearing modern, obviously Western supplied weapons, gear, arms, boots, everything. Um, so it's interesting, and the if you really wanted to arm and basically go total war and arm the entire population, that's going to become difficult because the weakness that Ukraine has is in its heavy equipment. All of its heavy equipment and its most modern heavy equipment is being supplied by the West. So eventually, Ukraine will run out of assets. It will run out of attritional assets. So it doesn't really matter if you can arm the entirety of your population with AK-47s from the Cold War. Uh, you know, it would be an entirely different mode and phase of the conflict if Ukraine were to try that strategy, and it would, I think, look a lot more similar to how the earlier phase of this war played out, where the Ukrainians basically just turned the city into a bunker, and um, with the Russians not being willing to shell the cities, just kind of holed up and waited for the armored columns to pass by and then ambush them when they got the chance.
Yeah. The Festin strategy. That's well, when you don't have a lot of heavy equipment like Ukraine does not have, then yeah, you'll have to do that. The other thing too is I think the reason why Ukraine has been able to put up such a spirited fight is how incredibly rapidly NATO and the United States mobilized the exfiltration of their old kit. They that got
Mm.
moved out so fast. Like
Oh
the
yeah.
most analysts before the war started didn't even predict that within like 2 to 3 months they'd empty out all their Cold War kit, and because that was just a huge dump on the Ukrainians, which without that they never could have even got to where they're at now vis-a-vis Russia, because their own domestic production would not have allowed them to produce that kind of equipment. And again, Ukraine's strength is in manpower, not so much technology or heavy equipment. And it's like, for example, back to this sort of like dog and pony show with propaganda. Sure, the HIMARS system is a very effective system. It has a 70-kilometer range. It does have smart munitions, which, to my knowledge, were not given to Ukraine. And but it's only like 20. Like this doesn't change the war. This is sort of like the Doolittle raid on Japan. It's a nice little propaganda victory, but it doesn't mean anything. And that seems to be Ukraine in a nutshell. Just take all these little cumulative Doolittle raids and spin it as like Kursk's.
Yeah. The interesting thing about the Cold War kit, I really do want to get shortly here into the actual like full list of what was given, but basically every single NATO affiliated country just dumped their Cold War era M113s and M777 howitzers, and pretty much everything that wasn't a main battle tank went to Ukraine. I just found it incredibly hilarious, right? All of these Humvees and M113s that are in cold storage, or have been ridden hard and put away wet for the last 20 years of on terror, multiple deployments, probably all that stuff went to Ukraine. So let's go ahead and get into it. Actually, so this is going to be if you I don't know how long you want to spend on this, but I'm just going to pretty much focus on the heavy equipment
Sure.
for reasons of time. Because if you can see, oh, I forgot I'm not sharing my screen, but yeah, there's a lot of stuff to go here. So let me go ahead and share screen again. All right. Come on. Why is it not going?
You might need to close the window and then open it up again. So
Mm,
in the panel
okay.
that you're using, it's going to have you and me and then the share screen. Just close it and then open it
Uh-huh.
up all over again. Try that.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Sure. Okay. Yeah, I'm trying to press the blue button. It won't go. Here we go. Okay. That should do it. All right. Cool. All right. So let's go ahead and go to the Wikipedia page. Can you all see the Wikipedia page
Yeah, I can
on
see
my
it.
screen? Perfect. All right. Cool. All right. So the Wikipedia page has a little more precise numbers as well, a little more than Oryx. Oryx kind of, I just mostly for their articles on NATO equipment, I use for the flavor and the tone, because of course, since they're so rapidly pro Ukraine and pro NATO, they will kind of signal in their articles on what exactly they want. And I for sure thought that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline happening was somehow connected with NATO's desire for Leopard 2s to go to Ukraine. That hasn't happened for the yet. I don't think Germany's given through the Ringtausch program Leopard 2s to Czechia, I believe, in exchange for T-72s and obvious BVP BMP variants. But they haven't actually given. No nation has, as of today, has given modern main battle tanks to Ukraine, but they've given all the Soviet stuff. So just so everybody's very clear, of course, everybody's given recoilless rifles and things. All right, so Canada. Canada's given, like we've said, M777 howitzers with obviously the GPS guided shells. They've given their modern ACSVs. This is like their version of the Striker combat vehicle. It's another APC, right? They've given Rochelle Sender IMVs or IMSs, which is like their version of the Humvee. Um, just all of this stuff, man. Just a lot of shit. So all right. So you get the idea. I'm trying to think of exactly where I want to focus here because it's just a lot. Where do I even start? Um,
How about the tanks?
yeah, let's start with the tanks. That's a good one. All right. So, like I said before, Czechia, the Czech Republic, has through Ringtausch and through other mechanisms given 40 plus T-72s. Here's an interesting thing, right? So, actually, there's a T-72 Avenger that I noticed earlier was actually crowdfunded. Um, and here tens of thoroughly modernized T-72s from private company Excalibur Army stock. Um, and of course, the T-72 M1s as well. So, like, this is the next thing, right? Once you've reeved out all of the T-72s and the BMPs and all of that stuff and all of the Cold War surplus that a lot of countries are willing to just give for nothing, you can actually start going to all sorts of defense private companies and defense contracting companies and start money laundering to purchase other weapons, right? And this is where you start looking at, okay, where are all the T-72s in the world? There's a lot of them. If you if you if I wanted to go to super deep dive, I would just literally look at where all the T-72s are and where all the places where the gay could draw from in terms of getting them equipment. All right, so that's at least 40 plus, says tens and tens, so at least minimum of 10, right? So that's at least 60, 61 just from the Czech Republic. Let's see. If you go all of the Finns, Estonians, Denmark, all of these other smaller countries that are in the Baltic, they kind of just all gave their usual M113s and artillery. Basically, they didn't give any tanks. Let's see, where's the other tanks? There we go. Who's this? This is Germany. Okay. All right. So, like I said before, Germany's running this Ringtausch program, which is basically just a weapons, um, a weapons delivery triangle where Germany takes its Leopard 2s, gives it to another country or some other like program straight from German active duty military stocks, and the other country like Czechia or Greece give old Soviet kit to Ukraine. So this isn't really a major program. It's more of like a a drop on top of everything else. Um, and like I mentioned before, the language that Oryx was using basically is very, very, um, I guess you would say, lukewarm towards Germany, even though Germany's given quite a bit of stuff. They actually, and why I thought that they wanted to force Germany to give the Leopard 2s because they're really kind of like, okay, Germany, this little program that you're running here is kind of cute, but that's not what we wanted. Um, so let's go down here to um, where's the tanks? Where is it? Where is it? You can see it's incredible amounts of stuff. And
Well, to be
um,
clear though, one thing to
so
add here is well, it's a lot of stuff. What
oh,
is
here
it?
we go.
It's
Here we
it's
go. Yeah,
mostly it's mostly artillery, it's mostly man pads, it's mostly shoulder launched anti-tank missiles, plus all the munitions for that. So it's
right,
interesting. Well, it is a lot. What it hides is that this none of this is heavy equipment. They're not jets. They're not main. Well, they're old main battle tanks from the Soviet era. And
right. Right. Oh, here we go. Okay, so I just pulled up Oryx. Right. This is their running tally. They have it a little more organized, not by country, but rather by equipment type. So this might be a little more helpful for our purposes. Okay. So they say that although they're a little less accurate, all of the privately purchased stuff isn't reflected on here. This is all just literally just government provided, basically. So they say that Ukraine has received 320 from various other European countries. So, like I said, about Czechia slash Germany has given around 40 T-72s. Um, and obviously, Czechia has purchased additional ones from Bulgaria and delivered them to Ukraine, right? Just the weapons truffle shuffle is just ongoing. So Poland has given 230 plus. The plus number to me is very significant because that's the bare minimum number, right? Poland has a lot more than 230 T-72s. I think they have a couple thousand actually. And they also have their homebrew upgrade of the T-72 called the PT-91. I don't think I have an indication of exactly how many they've given. Um, but obviously, if they're giving 230 T-72s, they're probably giving, more than just, one or two or 10. And then, of course, Estonia is given 8 plus T-72As. And then, of course, like we mentioned before, um, through the Ringtausch program, Slovenia is giving 28 M55Ss in exchange for German trucks, which is pretty significant because, in my view, the next thing in terms of like Cold War weapons truffle shuffle and that they can uh, give to the Ukrainians is Greece. I was doing some research into the M55 because it's a little bit of a weird tank. It's a Israeli redesign of the T55, right? So they basically put a bunch of modernized armor onto it, gave it a slightly higher horsepower engine, and put on a 155 or 105 millimeter NATO compatible main gun, which is pretty interesting for me because what are the other tanks in Europe that are compatible with NATO 105 millimeter shells? Well, that's Greece's M48s and M64s. So it just makes me wonder if that's possibly the next step that the powers that be could take.
well, to that
Even
point, real quick, I wonder if Israel is going to then offload M60 and Centurion kit because they have M60s
mm,
and Centurions that use 105, and they've kept them around since forever, but they probably don't need them anymore. They've got their own Merkava model tanks now.
hmm yeah, and this is when you start realizing of okay, how much exactly could be done if the powers that be wanted to be clever, right? Um, like we've mentioned before with and we'll get to it when we get to artillery. Actually, I think we might as well just wait for artillery until we get down there on the Oryx portion. All right. So for armored fighting vehicles, obviously Britain has given quite a few of various type. Um, infantry fighting vehicles, APCs. So you see 40, 210, 700 APCs, command vehicles, which are just another version of APC, right? MRAPs 600, infantry mobility vehicles 720 plus, right? This isn't even getting into like extremely clever ways that governments could perform ring tausch similar things, right? Tausch program, Czechia or Slovaks are giving BVPs via Germany, and Greece is already giving their old Soviet kit in exchange, or their old BMPs from Germany as well. So it depends on how clever the GAE wants to get in terms of how much it could provide. Right, like Greece basically gave almost its entire stock of BMPs to Ukraine through this program, like almost its entire stock. Um, and like I think actually Slovenia has two M55Ss left in their inventory, so I don't know if those are supposed to be queens or if those are like they're just keeping them in inventory for training reasons or something. I don't know. But just the sheer weight of numbers, right? And in any sort of um, combat footage that I've seen for the last couple of weeks with Ukraine's drive towards Kherson and towards Liman, um, you see a lot of infantry fighting vehicles, you see a lot of APCs, you see a lot of MRAPs and IMVs running around being shot by artillery under artillery fire, and occasionally you'll see a T-64 or whatever, or a T-72 M1. And that's pretty much what we're seeing getting destroyed. So I find that very fascinating, which kind of makes sense that this is all the equipment that has been provided in the last 6 months. Like you see all the delivery dates, right? April, June, May, June, July. So all of this stuff has to be shipped, right? Um, which means that if you look at these dates and if you give the Ukrainian mobilization plus 3 months of initial training for just a basic recruit who's been brought into the service, that pretty much tells you, okay, it's now October, April, May, June, July, August, September. Okay, so 5 months basically. You got 3 months of training, and then organization for another month or two, and planning, and now you're seeing an offensive, right? Um, so this is very interesting in terms of like exactly the timeline. Once you see these things end up in theater, and then how long it takes for these things in terms of supply chain to actually end up on the battlefield.
Well, what I see is just a lot of Russian losses, don't you know? I mean, these are
Oh
just Russian losses, guys. I mean, all these BMPs and T-55s and T-62s and T-7. These are just Russian losses. I don't know what you're talking about.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I've just from personal experience, right? I have seen the Dutch YPR 765s, and I've seen plenty of M113s. I've seen the Turkish version of the MRAP, right? That was the 50 out of the 200 or whatever that the Turks provided. I've seen actual confirmed kills of those. So it's interesting, right? Because the narrative is going to have to shift again, because once you start seeing combat losses from Western provided equipment, vice Soviet equipment that is basically compatible with Russia and can therefore be claimed as a Russian loss, it's a lot more difficult to spin that, right? Um, I mean, God, just 700 of M113 is just ridiculous, man. Just what a ridiculous amount of equipment. Um, Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, like I said, I've seen the at least two or three BMC Kirpies, which is the Turkish MRAP that's been KIA. I've seen um, Uh, I haven't seen any Max Pros end up dead yet, but I've seen. I haven't seen any Bushmaster, which are the, um, like I said, the Canadian version of the Humvee, basically. I've seen those in pictures, not KIA, but in present in theater. I've seen Ukrainians using the French VAB, and I've seen dead ones or ones that have been claimed dead, and it looks like it to my eye, but I'm not an intel expert, of course. Um, yeah, I've seen just a lot of foreign stuff that is now on the front getting killed and blown up after it's been provided. And like I don't want to make too big of a deal out of it, but the entire drive to Kherson and to Liman essentially looks almost like entirely provided, just from um, the stuff that I see um, in the past like few weeks. It's very interesting to me because like um, these all of these like vehicles. Oh, here's another one, right? Here's an interesting thing. So the Iveco, this particular IMV, right, and this VTLM Lince, right, um, those ones I think actually are Italian made, and like they're that particular IM infantry mobility vehicle actually also has a problem for identification because Russia purchased some of them prior to the war. So when you see the claimed one that's being blown up, that's just yet another. You know, it's insane how much equipment everybody has of each other's, right? Like I didn't even. This was just something that I didn't even know that Russia had purchased infantry mobility vehicles from Italy.
Well,
That's
let's see.
just a.
All Cold War kit lost is Russian losses. Duh. Duh. But
I
literally
mean,
every BMP, every T-72, they're all Russian losses. I don't know what you're talking about with this, Putler propaganda.
yeah, right. What do you with this Kremlin propaganda here? Uh, I mean,
We laugh,
uh,
but that's how people think.
I know, right? Um, so the interesting thing as well, right now we're getting into towed artillery, and of course, the first one on the list here is the Estonian 122 millimeter D30, which is a Soviet artillery piece from the late 1940s. Um, this is incredibly fascinating to me, right? Because the Russians also use the D30 and the 152 millimeter D20 as well. Um, and it just tells me, right, like you and I have talked about this before, but what I've long said in terms of warfare, like in terms of like modern warfare, you need to find ways to make old assets work for you, right? This is still like even though it's an obsolescent artillery piece and it doesn't have guided munitions and it's not fancy and it probably has slightly less range than the modern M77s, which are actually being replaced by the US military anyway. Of course, like we just said with the Cold War weapons dump, like all of these weapons are just being like reaved out of our inventory because oh look, here's a low cost way of getting rid of them so we can achieve a foreign policy victory. But it's interesting that all of these assets are being used to good effect even still. Like the fact that these are still being used is you know just goes to show you. So here's the numbers for the 150 or sorry, the M777, right? You have at least according to Oryx 142 have been given by the United States. A lot of other countries have given them as well, like we just saw with Canada gave at least four. They have all sorts of rounds for it. Everybody's providing all sorts of things, like the L118, L113, 105 millimeter towed gun. We've also given a significant amount of those. The French, ironically, have given, I shouldn't say ironically, they've also given substantial weapons equipment. Right, we saw with a lot of their IFEs, and they gave a lot of other stuff. Most of their the things that the gay wants from the French seems to be their artillery. Um, they gave quite a bit of their 155 millimeter towed howitzer, the Turf One. They also, I guess, right. This was purchased for Ukraine. Right. There's a lot of FH-70s. Right. These are like extremely old French guns that everybody just seems to be dumping. Like I said before, they're obsolete. They're just being stored in inventory. So you can see 250 towed artillery pieces. So that's not an unsubstantial number. And here's where you get into the real um, like uh, thing with the self-propelled artillery. The like our good buddy Jimmy Thomas said on his video, artillery is the king of the battlefield right now. So if you're giving, it does the overwhelming majority of casualties in modern warfare. So if you're even an artillery piece that's old from the Cold War, it's still an extremely useful asset. Um, so self-propelled guns, if anybody understands how they're utilized in modern warfare, is you kind of need self-propelled guns in order to support any sort of armored drive, which is basically what you're seeing the Ukrainians do. They're more mobile. You don't have to unhook it. You don't have to set it up. Right. You can. It's all self-contained in an armored vehicle. Right. So all of these old Soviet ones, 125 millimeter, 152 millimeter, et cetera, et cetera. This is the one that the gay wanted from France, right? This is the 155 millimeter Caesar, is France's latest and greatest artillery piece. And from what I understand, the French were actually taking, in, like they weren't actually. So let me see if I can remember the phrasing here. They were taking new guns and basically just giving them to Ukraine rather than putting them in their own stocks. So that's interesting, right? So they're not just taking it out of inventory or things that like the Germans are taking things out of active service, um, and then just giving them to Ukraine. They're actually taking them pretty much directly from the production line, and instead of having them go to one of their units, they're just giving them straight to Ukraine. So I find that as an interesting little thing there. What do you think?
Yeah. What's interesting about these newer artillery pieces, whether they're the Caesar or the HIMARS, is they're basically just. It looks like they're going back in time. They're just like flatbed trucks. Like I remember like in the '90s, you had what the Paladin system. I don't remember if they got. I think it got finished. I mean, it was basically a tank chassis with an artillery piece on it, and now it looks like they're just preferring mobility, because of course the HIMARS and the Caesar are maneuverable. And yeah, it is interesting that the Caesar is a current tier artillery piece and not an old one. Um,
Yeah,
Presumably, it's okay. I think I know why, right? Because if they're going for mobility over protection, then you can shoot and scoot and basically plink the Russians while their artillery still dug in. That's what I'm thinking is probably going on.
right. And with the utilization of guided munitions, they're not going to not give the Ukrainians guided munitions. Like they've already given them the guided munitions for the M77s, like the Canadians and we have. So they're not going to give them only the low tier munitions for this stuff. They're going to give them the high tier stuff as well. Um, so first the M109, just all the NATO variants that have been used. The Panzerhaubitze 2000, obviously from the Netherlands, and so that's 8. And then the German government just gave them 14 of these things. And then the interesting thing, right, and this is all of the different clever ways, right? The Germans are actually have been pretty intelligent in how they're transferring weapons to Ukraine through Ringtausch. Um, this is just another way to do that, right? They basically donate money to Ukraine, right, through the Security Capacity Building Fund, and Ukraine purchases directly new from German arms manufacturers 100 Panzerhaubitze 2000s, right? So, I mean, this is, you know, oh yeah, there it is right there, including smart and volcano guided shells. Like, so of course they're not just going to give them the low tier crap. Um, of course, more 109s from all these different various Baltic countries and Eastern Europeans, all this ex-Soviet. Um, yep, and then 155 millimeter Caesar 8x8. So these are the ones that you're referring to on the trucks. Um, yep, yep.
Well,
Um,
I think real quick, what we're going to see is, as you've pointed out, we're clearing through the Soviet kit, and now we're giving Ukraine Western kit. It's going to be a lot harder to claim those are Russian losses at this point.
correct,
And
correct.
I think what'll happen is that as we see more and more Western kit destroyed, we'll begin to develop a new picture about Ukraine, and we'll begin to realize that the MSM was not, strictly speaking, being honest about this.
Yeah, correct. Um, and then of course MLRS is right. There's the infamous HIMARS, right? But of course, you know, with that you've gotten, you know, lots of quantities of, you know, old Soviet MLRSs and you know, the grad launchers, etc. Um, and of course, the Germans gave their version of the MLRS as well. Same thing with the British. Same thing with the French. Right? Pretty much all, like, these are small quantities though, and um, uh, these aren't even like the modern HIMARS with extremely long range ammunition. Um, but you know, they're still necessary, right? Because as you can see in Ukraine, even from the very outset, MLRSs are actually extremely effective at, you know, area saturation. Like, everybody has to have them now. You can't just have tube artillery.
Well, one of the things too is we've seen that a lot of platforms are getting lighter and faster. So whether it's the Marines giving up Abrams for this new medium tank with the 105, I mean, they're doing it. I mean, it sounds crazy, but that's what they're doing. We see these lighter artillery pieces. We're seeing more thin-skinned vehicles. All of a sudden, saturation bombardment is a lot more effective because, you know, going up against, say, a fleet of Abrams, Bradleys, and Paladins, that probably wouldn't be very effective. But going up against, you know, say HIMARSs, medium tanks, and strikers, yeah, that could actually do a lot of damage.
Right. And of course, when we keep scrolling down here, so this is when you start getting into like air defense systems. And this is the big push that we're starting to see now, right? Because Russia is now, in addition to its usual strategy of using, you know, its, you know, caliber and et cetera, guided missiles, now is actually purchasing drones from Iran. And these drones are obviously the suicide ones, right? I think they're called the Garan. Yeah, the Garan. And so, what do the Ukrainians need now? Oh, they need surface to air missile systems, right? And we've given them quite a bit of, you know, man portable systems. Pretty much every single nation, like in the first week, gave Ukraine incredible amounts of anti tank weaponry of man portable, uh, you know, man portable anti tank and surface to air missiles, right? But this is the stuff that actually kind of matters, because it's much longer range, because you can actually set up um, um, area denial. And if right now Ukraine doesn't have the ability to set up area denial, well, you don't actually see a lot of combat footage of Russian planes doing, you know, surface to air attacks like we would do. But you do see occasional sorties from the Russians with their air force. They're being really conservative, in my view, with their air force. So we'll see if Surovikin changes that. But he's a little more aggressive. But the thing with this stuff is, you know, all of these. surface to air missile batteries are incredibly important. And you can't actually have an armored drive if you don't actually have um, the ability to defend it, with either surface to air missile systems or with your own air power to give you air cover. Because then, as we saw in World War II and in Desert Storm, if you have an armored column just driving along a road, if it's not going to get shelled by artillery, well, then your enemy is just going to use air assets to gun it down while it's driving. So, yeah, this stuff is incredibly important.
Oh, absolutely. Also, too, man-pad systems are a great way to limit the effect of attack helicopters. Even in the second Iraq War, even though the United States had a full air superiority and was relatively successful in the first few weeks of the war, Iraqi man-pads still shot down a lot of Apache helicopters, and frankly, also the desert conditions of Iraq. But helicopters, they're still effective. I think what man-pads and man portable anti-tank missiles do, they don't render helicopters and tanks obsolete. What they do is they punish you for being careless and they constrain their use.
Mm-hmm. Right. And it really, all in terms of constraining use, it means that, okay, you have intelligence that this area has, man pads. Okay, well, are you going to send your helicopters there? Well, not if you don't want to lose it. So much of warfare obviously is just forcing your enemy to do things that they don't want to do and to deny areas to them. Okay, so this is when you start getting into the big and other more big deals, right? Anti-ship missiles, and it says small quantities here, but actually it's much larger, more than what they're saying. You don't need a lot. Even if Ukraine has one or two launchers, they do have anti-ship cruise missiles of their own homebrew design, which is what they used on the Moskva. What this is doing, right, is if you have a battery of ASCMs sitting near Odessa, you're going to be able to with the range of Harpoon, which is it's a missile which is showing its age, as I frequently said, but it's not totally useless. So if you have a basic Harpoon battery sitting near in the vicinity of Odessa, then you can prevent the Russians from actually blockading it. Why is this important? Well, it's important because weapons deliveries, right? If the Ukrainians don't have Odessa, or if the Russians are able to blockade Odessa, all of the armament deliveries that go to Ukraine have to go through Poland, and that's it's much easier to transport heavy equipment, specifically via ship rather than by road or by rail, because a rail system you can like what you're seeing what the Russians do now. They're using precision munitions to destroy the rail lines basically, and Ukraine has a problem with its rail lines is that it's all old Soviet infrastructure. So getting the replacement for that stuff once it's attrited is going to be very difficult for them.
Yeah, because it's different gauge in the West, and yeah, by transporting any good or service by sea is the most economical way to do it, and preferred, unless second best is rail. But then if you have to switch gauges, that's going to make it more difficult. The other thing too is if it goes through Poland, it's going to go to Lviv, and then Russia can just keep on shelling Lviv with guided missiles, and it's going to be, they're going to have an effective way of interdicting it once it makes it into Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, here's an interesting thing. This is very low tech. The 70 millimeter laser guided rocket launchers on pickup trucks. I've actually seen one of those on the Russian Telegram channels. They claim that they destroyed it, and from what it looks like, I was like, what the heck is this thing? You know, it's just weird. It looks like it should have
It
been in the Middle East.
it
But
looks
yeah,
like, if you ever play Command and Conquer Generals, it looks like something the GLA would use.
yeah. It's one of those. It's literally a truck with like a rinky dink looking rocket launcher on the back, and I'm just like this thing looks like something that ISIS would construct. Man, it's like why is any Western power making this thing anyway? This is I laugh at this stuff, man. It's funny. Um, okay, so now we're getting into aircraft, right? Obviously, Ukraine has been given a lot of aircraft in one form or another. Um, I actually think that Oryx's um, site hasn't been updated yet. It says Macedonia had given Su-25s, and NATO member states have purchased 14 of these things from Bulgaria. Um, they were talking about early in the conflict about Poland giving their Su-29s, I think. And I think also Czechia was discussing giving the Su-29s, the dozen or 2 dozen of them that they had, to the Ukrainians as well. Um, so that's an interesting thing also. And when you hear about the missing Russian Air Force, well, okay, well, where's the Ukrainian Air Force? You don't hear about the Ukrainians losing aircraft as much as you used to. You don't see combat footage as much of random aircraft getting shot down. It's really weird the how this war has just been very low on terms of aircraft usage.
Well, you see, that just clearly means the Ukrainians are winning because they're not losing any more airplanes. Duh. I mean, they're just shooting down. There's so many ghosts of Kievs out there. The Russians are just getting owned.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, no, the thing is, the problem with this war is what Baudrillard talks about. It's hyper reality. Like we get this war mediated through this sort of digital propaganda space, and it makes it very, very difficult. I mean, a war is happening. We know that. That's not the issue. But what makes it
Hmm.
difficult to follow is just the way the information from the ground is getting to us. And it makes it really hard. Like I said this before, in Syria, when ISIS was attacking in 2011 to 14 onward, we got daily accurate updates of the conflict that was developing with like battle losses and everything. And now it's just like I don't see any of that. Like Ukraine, it's really hard to find, detailed accounts of battles with the facts. I mean, we could do it for ISIS. I don't see why we can't do it, say, with embedded journalists in Ukraine already. I found that very suspicious.
Yeah, so do I. And it just tells you that the powers that be don't want us seeing things out of Ukraine for one reason or another, and I think that they understand as well as we understand that Ukraine is kind of the fulcrum of where history rests right now. Um, I don't want to make it sound like it's a bigger deal than it actually is, but it's a pretty big deal if Russia can give a foreign policy black eye to the current ruling class. Here's another thing, right? So all of these other assets, right? These are more like UAVs and loitering munitions and things. Obviously, you've heard about the switchblades that have been given.
Yep.
Um, and the Phoenix Ghosts and all this other stuff. This is all important, right? And we touched earlier on the using thinner armor of tanks, right? Using not maybe as heavy of a tank as a T-72 or an M1 A2 battles tank, um, or even like a Leopard 2. The the utilization of these kinds of munitions, which are extremely effective against tanks and are basically one-shot kills, um, means that okay, well, why would I even make a main battle tank with a 120 millimeter gun or even a 105 millimeter gun? Why wouldn't I just make tanks that are 75 or 85 millimeters? I find it very interesting because I forget what the BMP variant is of it, but there's a BMP variant. I think it's called the BMP one or something with a 75 millimeter gun on it, and I'm like, that's oddly similar to the profile of a World War II tank, right? Um, you know, and the only difference is that it can, carry a squad of guys, other than, World War II tanks couldn't, right? But I find that very interesting that, we have to make this distinction between armored fighting vehicles.
So what's interesting here, right, is I think the first munition that really perfected this was the Javelin, the top attack feature, and also with improved mines, because the two most vulnerable parts of a tank are the hatch, the top, and then the underbelly with the mines and IEDs.
Hmm.
And I think what we've seen is that mines and top attack missiles, and by extension of loitering munitions and suicide drones, have become so effective at these attacks that we're, this is the analogy that I come up with, right? So when gunpowder became used on a large scale, it was the death knell for armored knights and armored swordsmen because the armor made you too slow to actually be effective, and it was not a guaranteed protection against a bullet coming in from an arquebus. So eventually, the armor was ditched, except for the cuirassiers, in favor of mobility. And I think we're seeing a revolution sort of like that now, where
Hmm.
we even see this with like the the Caesar system we talked about and HIMARS. It's basically just a truck with a gun on it or a rocket launcher. And in that case, you could argue that speed and then also active defenses. So like there's you can fire out chaff to confuse a missile. You could have the laser was a razzle dazzle system to like confuse the missile, or even have an active counter battery that has a active radar that shoots ammunition at the missile as it comes in, and that's going to be more effective than actually just taking the hit. In which case, mobility. Well, to be honest, back to your point, I do know that there is that BMP variant with a 75 millimeter gun. I feel like we're going to see a return of assault guns. Like the Stug. That was in World War II. The Stug killed more armored vehicles than any other German armored vehicle. It was like the ultimate Allied tank killer, and it was just a lowly Stug, which was supposed to be a direct fire weapon. And yeah, I
Hmm.
can definitely see that. And the other thing we have to keep in mind too is the ebb and flow of gargantuism, right? So I did this in my episode on naval warfare during the Second Punic War. You have these behemoth quinqueremes that were like a crew of 300, and then after that you go back to like small ships like biremes by the time you get to the Battle of Actium. And part of it was the cost of building these gargantuan ships was just too much wood, too much money. They were not seaworthy; they could sink in a storm. And I think something like an Abrams or a Leopard or a Challenger are just too expensive. They're too expensive to lose. And so they're too. It's like the German battleships in World War One. They were too expensive to lose, so they weren't used very much. But then why even have them if you can't even use them? And I think that's the logic of gargantuanism blowing up in our face. Whereas Russia still produced, those. The average weight of a Russian battle tank is like 45 tons, whereas the average weight for a NATO battle tank is like 70, which means that the Russians can afford to lose their tanks and we really can't.
Right, right. That's just an interesting thing about this the Stug. Um, I think that's very fascinating, is because it's also cheaper to not have a turret. If you're just making an armored vehicle with an integrated gun, like in World War II, that I forget what the difference in price was. It was pretty substantial. That was, I think, I think the Panzer IV was like 35,000 Reichsmarks or something, and a Stug was much cheaper than that. But anyway, yeah, so cheaper. You build it because it's going to get broken, and don't invest too heavily in a super weapon system that can kill everything, because ultimately every weapon system is going to be killed. So the other interesting thing here, right, is the logistical equipment and the reestablishment of naval capability for the Ukrainians here. Remember when I talked about the um, prevention of a Russian blockade on Odessa? Well, this is the stuff that you're going to use with that, right? You have riverine craft, 40-foot riverine patrol boats, Sea Arc patrol boats. I mean, the Germans have this unknown autonomous surface vessel, which is basically a remote ship. Um, and so, yeah, all of these little things which are there to ensure that Ukraine can have at least some capability restored to it. Just another thing for the Russians to chew through. The other thing that's significant is the engineering equipment, right? The one thing that the Germans, from a NATO perspective, could be praised for is their willingness to give the Ukrainians engineering stuff. Like you see 16 bridge layers, 15 armored recovery vehicles, 4 remote controlled mine clearance systems. Um, and of course, the Czechs gave old Soviet pontoon bridges probably as well. And the French gave some. But any sort of armor drive like we're seeing in Kherson or Liman is not going to happen in Ukraine without the ability to cross over rivers. And the Ukrainians did not start the war with a lot of engineering equipment either. Like this is probably one of their greatest deficiencies. They have it, and this is fascinating to me because if you have this logistical capability to actually begin any sort of offensive drive, having this stuff is going to be very useful for you.
Yeah, yeah, and to be fair, Russia had struggled as well with the engineering river crossing. I forget which river, but there was a river in the Donbass that was a bit of a snafu in the crossing. And yeah, you're going to need a lot of that because Ukraine has like 3 or 4 major rivers that you have to cross at some point. So yeah, that's going to be a big deal. And logistics is of course important because you can't, fire guns that don't have any ammo, right? So you need those trucks and everything else. I think the really interesting thing here is with all of this equipment, this is basically one giant money-making operation, right? War is, what was it, the rule of acquisition? I forget which number it was, but war is good for business, to quote the Ferengi. And we're seeing that war is good for business. It's a way to offload all of these useless, obsolete weapons at a marked up price to a country that's desperate, to then generate demand at home for more military production because all of a sudden, what do you know, guys? We've cleared out our vaults. We need more military equipment. And yeah, I mean, it's worked.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now that we've gone through the casualty counts and we've taken a look at the raw numbers of at least what the low figure for what Ukraine is receiving in terms of military aid. Um, I'm going to go ahead and pull up the comparison numbers here for what equipment Ukraine had at the start of the war. Okay, so this has obviously been passed around. Everyone can find this online. I think this is from the Australian Broadcasting Company is the source for this. With roughly 2,500 main battle tanks, according to this. This is contradicted by this other source I have here, but we'll get into that in a second, right? So what they're saying, this is the absolute low ball number for what Ukraine had, right? Remember that figure that we mentioned before for 6,020 of armored vehicles of all types that the Russians had claimed that they had killed. So what the Russians have claimed that they've killed, if this figure is the correct figure, is they have killed the entire Ukrainian tank park and armor park. This is obviously says plus, but or they've killed very close to it. So that's an interesting number, right?
Real
And it
quick, you're
kind of
still showing us the Oryx page.
oh, am I sorry? Can you see the picture that I have up right now?
No, I see now a more Oryx page of
Orange
tank
page.
kills.
Okay. Okay, yeah, I'm trying to see if you can see the picture I have up right now. Maybe I can just Google it. Um, yeah, this will work. Okay. Let's see. Where is it? Oh, here it is. Okay, here's the one I want. Oh no, view image, and then we'll have the comparison for this one as well. Okay, cool. All right, so this is the one I'm talking about right here. Okay, so this is from ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Service, and what they were claiming at the start of the war was, okay, you have roughly 2,500 battle tanks, you have 2,800 armored vehicles of, obviously their BMP variants, right? Um, you have 1,900 artillery and mortar systems, and they have 231 combat aircraft and 139 attack helicopters. So if you remember what I was saying earlier with what the Russians were claiming, they've claimed that they have killed 325 airplanes and 162 helicopters, 6,020 tanks and other AFEs, 874 combat vehicles equipped with MRLS, 3,521 field artillery cannons and mortars. Okay, so let's just do a quick numbers comparison here. All right, so in terms of what they've said, they've obviously claimed that they've killed the entire Ukrainian tank park, like hands down. Um, Compared to artillery, they've said they have more, according to at least this source, they've basically killed like 30% more or 50% more of what Ukraine was claimed to have at the start of the war. In terms of towed artillery, or all total artillery, I guess you could say. Um, Combat capable artillery, 200, or sorry, combat capable aircraft, 231. They've claimed that they have killed, where is it? 325 airplanes. So obviously they've killed at least 100 more airplanes, right? That's aircraft of all type. That doesn't say fighter jets. This is fighter jets, obviously. Um, and then attack helicopters. Ukraine started with 139. And they also have said the Russians claim that they've killed 162 helicopters of various type. Okay. Um, this is what the Ukrainian Navy was, and no nuclear weapons, major warships, etc. Okay, so you can kind of tell from this chart. This chart over here makes a little more sense, because if the Russians were fighting against this army would basically be done, even with the Western help that they're receiving. Like, this army wouldn't be able to fight, wouldn't be able to push to Liman or Kherson. So I'm more inclined to believe this figure right here. And this is a number from Global Firepower, right? .com. This is estimated from 2014. So this is prior to, or right around the time of the 2014 Donbass conflict. Who knows how much they've lost since then. So they claim that Ukraine has just over 4,100 tanks, which still, and 6,400 AFEs of various type, right? So if Russia's claiming to build 6,000, okay, well, you've killed 2/3 of what Ukraine has started the war with in terms of armor. And they said 493 helicopters. Okay, so a few little fewer helicopters, but a lot higher in terms of the amount of claimed war planes. So Ukraine still has some, apparently, according to this, but they've taken 325 to 400. Okay, so that's roughly 3/4 out of their air force. This is the highball number, remember. Artillery, so this one says that they have 2,800, and the Russians on their Telegram have claimed that they have destroyed 3,500 field artillery cannons and mortars. and I'm assuming that the Russians are probably in that field artillery and mortars. They're probably also classifying um, uh, man portable 80 millimeter mortars as well, and smaller mortar types like 60 millimeter, like company level mortars and things like that, right? Um, so even still, like, they're claiming that they basically have wiped out the entirety of Ukraine's artillery park. Um, Warships. Okay, we went through that, defense budget, etc. So that's pretty interesting to me, um, which tells me that the numbers got to make sense. Tell me what the numbers mean, Mason. What do they mean? Um, so this tells me that with the Western aid that we've seen, right, a couple of hundred vehicles here or there, if you assume that this is the number that we're using for what the Ukrainians have, and this is the highball number, so it's probably, if you split the difference, right, that means that Ukraine doesn't have a lot of um, homebrew assets left in this fight, um, which tells me that the list that you have over here with Oryx, with the lowball number of aid to Ukraine, with 320 T-72 variants, basically, and not all of them have arrived. Hundreds of various armored fighting vehicles or infantry fighting vehicles or infantry mobility vehicles or MRAPs, et cetera, basically mechanized infantry vehicles of various type. I think that's probably 200. That's 1,000. Let's see, 1,600. What's that? And then what is that? If you're counting an infantry mobility vehicle as an MRAP or an armored vehicle, or basically just an armored vehicle of whatever type, right? With a 50 cal machine gun on it. So that's what I'm doing math in my head here. Roughly 2,500, basically, off the top of my head, 2,500 to 3,000, somewhere in that ballpark. Um, so that leaves, if the Russians have claimed that they've killed 6,000, okay, so that's, if you take these numbers right here, so that's, just assume a 50% casualty rate from both tanks and armored fighting vehicles. Okay, so you've got 2,000 tanks left on the highball number, and let's see, 3,000, 6,000 minus by 3,000 is 3,400, and plus what we said with the lowball number here on Oryx was 1,700 or so. So you've probably got 4,000, almost 5,000 armored fighting vehicles and Humvees left. And then obviously this is probably like, with only 320 tanks, that's going to be like 2,200 basically and change. So that's looking like what Ukraine has at the moment. And that's the lowball number. If we wanted to go into that, like, obviously Wikipedia says that they've received more through other various sources, in terms of tanks, armored fighting vehicles, et cetera, artillery, all of that stuff. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I tend to agree with the sort of assumptions you're making for this for these guesstimates, because yeah, I mean, if Russia had wiped out all of Ukraine's tank and artillery parks, then they couldn't be attacking at Kherson and Kharkiv. That literally can't be true. But also, by the same token, Ukrainians can't have killed as many Russians as they've said. I think both sides are trying to fudge the numbers a little bit, but I think Ukraine's fudging them more. And I also think you're probably right that more was given to Ukraine than has been officially stated, because they still seem to have a lot of fight left in them, which the mere numbers you stated that are quote official don't seem to make up the difference.
Yeah. And I know, like, this is why I went to the Oryx site, because that was a little more organized. But like the you can see in terms of the difference, right? And I'm sure Wikipedia is a little more updated than Oryx is, because that's Oryx is just a couple guys out of their garage running a website, whereas Wikipedia is like actual news sources, etc. Um, the thing is you can see that there's there's just more stuff from various sources being delivered, and maybe it's not that much more in terms of like, okay, how many tanks can we buy through crowdfunding sources and things like that, and how many tanks can we purchase from random defense companies, etc. Like that's probably not that many. That's going to be in the dozens, not in the hundreds. um and let's see if I can look at this here. Yeah, but most of the stuff seems to be, at least from the official sources, Wikipedia is not that much different. Um, for like artillery, that stuff seems to be pretty well cataloged on Oryx. Although I have seen there's a little bit more stuff that they put in terms of like how exactly much that Ukraine is getting for obviously the small arms and little things that you don't really think about, like, okay, who's giving bandages, who's giving humanitarian aid, who's just funding the Ukrainians basically. And it's a lot of stuff. um,
Yeah, it is.
so I think we can safely assume that Ukraine has gotten far more than they deserve, and like I mentioned before, like Ukraine in terms of its armor, if my calculations are correct, using that highball number we said earlier, is at least down like 50% casualties, even with Western aid for their armor.
Yeah,
So
I understand. Those are all Russian losses.
yeah,
Sorry.
yeah, yeah. All right. Let's see. Giselle.
Yeah, they're back.
Okay. Self-propelled guns are also key not to getting murked by counter battery fire. Yeah, yeah. I think we addressed that earlier. Unless they've gotten better, the Copperhead 155 rounds are hot garbage. Compared to what? Compared to Soviet 152 millimeter rounds? Hmm.
Exactly.
I mean, these are dumb rounds you're talking about. Like, I mean, hot garbage in what respect? Did they don't detonate? Do they have misfires? Do they not? Are they more likely to do they have safety issues? Like, why? Anyway, um, Cringe Walker, the Eternal Co Master here with Cringe Walker.
Yeah, I
I
know.
still, I still think you still think Ukraine can pull it off. But I'm far more interested in how the West will explain a fascist state with NATO equipment ruling the East after the war. Oh man.
Well,
uh,
I'm not seeing it yet. I'm not seeing it yet.
mhm. Yeah. Let's see what else. Oh, he says the copperheads are the guided rounds. They don't land on target nor reliably detonate. Oh, that's interesting. That's very interesting.
Hmm.
Hmm. Well, I mean, that's considering how many M777s we've given them. I mean, that's possibly also why. um, because obviously, like we mentioned at the start of the stream, they're getting rid of that particular artillery piece. They're phasing it out for the newer one. So yeah, that's fascinating to me. That's a way to get rid of that particular little problem. You can manage yourself to victory. Um, let's You got anything to say on that praise?
I don't know one way or the other about the Copperhead rounds. That's pretty old tech from like the 90s, I think.
Well, I think the guided rounds are newer, so I don't know. Maybe they might be technically semi guided, if anything. Um, let's see. Also, he says, would Yukis even be able to use new MBTs effectively enough to make it worth it? Well, that is the question of the hour, right? At this point, what exactly can Ukraine use main battle tanks for if their air force is attrited, basically does non-existent almost. Um, like, what good would a main battle tank be at this point?
Well, this is where I think it starts to get a little scary, right? That's when NATO is going to start sending personnel in, sort of
Ugh.
like China's volunteers in Korea. Oh,
Mm,
well, look at all these, challengers and leopards, how to use them. So, I mean, I'm not saying this
uh,
can happen, but I'm that's a possibility.
yeah, I mean, you've already seen. At least I've seen combat footage on the Russian Telegram channels of the um, uh, mercenary quote unquote forces, and which would obviously look like American special forces or military contracting company professionals, basically, um, getting KIA'd, and that's basically confirmation that we do have boots on the ground. We know that our special forces are probably involved at minimum in training, and probably on active roles in the front line as well. So I don't know. It just we're going to get slowly sucked into this the longer it goes on, unfortunately. So, I mean, we'll see what happens in the next 3 months.
Well,
I really,
one thing I want to say as well. At the start of this conflict, I predicted that a worst case scenario would be something like Korea. So in Korea, we had the U.S. fighting the Chinese, and the Soviets were actively sending fighter pilots. Now, the U.S. would not attack targets in Vladivostok. The U.S. would not attack targets in Manchuria, not officially, but we knew we were fighting Russians and we knew we were fighting Chinese. But it was limited to that battle space. I think Ukraine could develop in a worst case scenario in that fashion.
hmm, hmm, I don't know. I kind of, I'm very much of the opinion that once Russian mobilization starts to actually get moving and they have the manpower to do what they actually need to do and just steamroll the Ukrainians, I think that it's going to be over pretty quickly. And
Well,
my prediction is January.
that plus, to paraphrase Game of Thrones, winter's coming.
Yeah,
with
yeah,
with the coming energy crisis, you think Europe is going to be able to ship all this stuff to Ukraine when they can't even heat their cities?
right, right. It becomes increasingly difficult to justify, and that's the thing with the weapons that have been given so far. Like giving ancient Cold War era weaponry that you were planning on phasing out by the end of the decade, anyway, is not a difficult sell. Um, what is a difficult sell is um, giving your modern, super expensive, high precision, high speed gear that's very, very expensive, and that you already don't have enough of yourselves. Um, and what's also difficult to justify is increasingly having to just simply purchase or straw purchase arms from other various places in the world and have all of that equipment go to Ukraine. Like I think um, um, if the gay wanted to get really clever, it could start purchasing T-72s from the third world and have them shipped to Ukraine, because there are just thousands upon tens of thousands of these things floating around. So that would be a way to do that. I'm just thinking in my most Machiavellian mindset here. But there comes a point, at least in Europe, where you can't do that anymore, because you're basically just going to have to be able to um, take money, get weapons either from your own defense contractors or give it to Ukraine so Ukraine can purchase it, like we discussed with the 100 Panzer Haubitze 2000s, or you just literally just purchase weapons from a third world and do the same with them and give it to Ukraine, basically. However, they've already reaved out all of Eastern Europe of a lot of the old Soviet kit, so there's a lot less stuff just to be given away for free. And I think they're rapidly coming up to the point where the stuff that they can outright just purchase for Ukraine and give it to them, or do these little like crafty tricks of having Ukraine do it, that's starting to come to an end. I think that's when they start really seeing the limitations of resources.
Yeah. Well, because again, this is stuff they were going to get rid of anyhow, right? And like you said, the expensive kit. One, it's expensive. Do you want to give it away? Two, as we mentioned earlier, can the Ukrainians even use it? That's another thing too. And yeah, there's just a lot of variables that we don't have good data on.
Mm. Yeah, and so much of this is just really depends on Russia and what Russia wants to do. From what the Russians with Attitude guys were saying on their podcast last week, it sounds like the typical stereotype that we think of the Russians as the crazy Ivan stereotype is that Putin is actually kind of holding the Russians back a little bit, and being very moderate and peaceable in his policy. And we'll see what happens with the change of personnel with Surovikin, right? Because he's a little bit more of a hard ass and a hardliner. So um, this is why I pulled up Cringewalker's comment here. He says, at best, Russia can pull out of a Pyrrhic victory of Crimea and Donbass, but they're going to lose Kherson soon, and then likely Melitopol in the spring. We'll see, Cringewalker. Time will tell. I do believe that what the United States and NATO is attempting to do with this, and also Zelensky with this whole offensive, is strategic goals is you need to be able to retake ground before the winter and before the rains make the ground too muddy, and where offensive logistics becomes difficult. And you want to be able to, now that Russia has announced general mobilization, you need to be able to recapture a effective defensive position. And for Ukraine, that means they need to take Russia's foothold on the western side of the Dnieper away, basically. And that way you can at least just say, okay, I have at least one defensible boundary. If I need to, I can just blow the bridges up across the Dnieper, and that'll complicate Russian offensive operations trying to go to the west. The other thing is for Western arms dumps, right? They need this as a propaganda, as a public relations win to prove that, oh, all of these weapons weren't in vain. So I need to make sure that they're being put to good use. They need to be seen to be put to good use. And, well, I mean, they're being put to some use, but we'll see.
Yeah, I think that you're right with the 300,000 reservists being called up, and Russia, again, they don't get rid of their tanks, so they have like in mothball and active duty something like 12,000 AFVs. It's some ridiculous number, and like the West doesn't have that deep of a pocket for AFVs, and that's not even including armored infantry fighting vehicles and such. I mean, it's ridiculous. And as you've said, as we go for lighter, faster, that Cold War kit, even World War II kit, might actually be serviceable. And so it's actually something that might work. But this is what I think people need to not lose sight of. Okay, this is just my take on the issue, but I think it all works together. Ukraine is but one front in a broader global struggle between Russia and China on the one hand, leading the BRICS alliance, the Eurasianists, for lack of a better word, and the Atlanticists, the US and NATO. And what I think the broad strategy is, and we've seen this with Z and Putin, they have been very careful to go by the letter of international law, right? All those elections in those provinces, that was not for the US. That was for the rest of the UN, Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and so on and so forth. China made appeals to international law in August about Taiwan. So what I think they're doing, and I don't know when they're going to pull the trigger on this, they're planning, I think, a diplomatic coup in the UN to say, hey, look, we both have veto power. We're Security Council members. NATO is just, the UN is just a front for U.S. imperialism. We're all tired of the U.S. pushing us around. Why don't we try to push some resolutions in the UN that'll like defang the U.S. And China, I think, as I've said elsewhere, is probably going to attack Taiwan sometime before 2030. I'd be surprised if they don't. And they're waiting for Russia. Russia's kind of a cat's paw. They're sort of baiting out what the West will do. What will the West do? And Russia and China are taking notes and planning accordingly. So I think this is part of a broader, long game, diplomatic energy. Right? Russia's got the energy trump card. So yeah, that's what I think is the big picture that I think it's too easy to mistake the forest for the trees with Ukraine and these battle statistics, which again are interesting and help shape our understanding of the conflict. But we can't look at this conflict in isolation. It's a part of a broader global struggle.
Praise, I think we lost you there. You kind of roboted and fell off there.
Oh, oh, okay. I'll just repeat myself again. Ukraine is a part of a broader global struggle. Russia and China have been very careful to play it by the letter of the law with regards to international law, is to sort of contrast with the U.S. constantly flouting it. And so their goal is to, one, use Russia as a cat's paw to bait out the West and Ukraine. Two, to play the energy crisis card. And then three, to build some sort of coalition in the UN to defang the West and to limit, U.S. ambitions. And so I think Ukraine is a part of a broader power play that if we don't keep in mind, certain things don't make sense.
Mm. Yeah, that's definitely true. I'm always very troubled by the fact that Russia and China are now in the same corner, or are appearing to be coalescing into the same corner against the United States. I find that extremely troubling and insane from my geopolitical perspective, as somebody who's more affiliated with our realist buddies. Um, so let's see. Cringe Walker says they'll lose Crimea and get stuck with the ruins of Donbass. Giselle says, my contacts at Fifth Group say the Green Beanies are doing very limited training and are told to keep their hands clean at the moment. All Americans in theater are contractors. Okay, well, that's good news so far. Yeah, at least we're not having our special forces do anything. It's all people who want to get doing it to get paid, I guess. Cringe also says it is worth noting that in South Ukraine, the weather does not get too cold in the winter. This is also why Russia could take so much in the south, despite it being February and March. Right. Oh, and also that it also really gets below freezing occasionally in November to January, mostly at night. Days stay relatively above freezing mostly. Okay, well, right, Cringe Walker, but as we mentioned before, logistics is going to be more of a problem for the Ukrainians than it is for the Russians. Um, and that's one of the reasons why Germany gave the armored recovery vehicles and the pontoon bridges and things like that. That stuff is all pretty easy for the Russians to target. And once it's gone, it's gone. You can't replace that kind of stuff pretty easily if you don't have large numbers of it. So the thing with any sort of offensive that the Ukrainians are doing is this is why they're pushing now, right? I want to be very clear that that is the reason why I think they're pushing now, because they know that they need to retake Kherson and they need to retake everything to the west of the Dnieper before the winter snows and rains start to make things complicated, right? It's not impossible to overcome these logistical difficulties, but it just adds another complication to things and makes forward momentum a lot more difficult to sustain.
Yeah, yeah, and again, Russia doesn't get rid of its old kit, and so they have a lot of it from the Cold War. I think in this kind of attrition style conflict, not just in terms of manpower, which goes without saying, Russia has much deeper reserves than Ukraine, and apparently even NATO has.
Yeah, again. There we go. Okay, just wanted to show everybody again, just to be totally clear, how many tanks Russia has. So just look, just 20,750 plus 20,000. And if you look at Oryx, how many did they say the Ukrainians have killed? 1,415.
Even if
Mm,
that's true, that's not much.
yes. So out of the total losses, Russia's only like lost 7% of their tanks. Not
Yeah.
even 7%.
Well, look at their AFVs. Look at that. Their armored fighting vehicles,
Okay.
19,420 plus. Like,
Yeah,
hmm.
I know. Look at down there, right? Okay, so 19,420
And that's in storage.
in active.
That's like
Just I know, right?
34,000.
I know, right? Jesus. Just I mean, like for all of the talk at the beginning of the war, uh, of oh look at the Russian art like armored columns are getting owned by RPGs. Oh, it's like, bro,
Bro,
bro, they lost five. This is like, you know, just
no,
ugly
it's literally
memes.
insane. Like, it's so if we include tanks and armored vehicles in storage and active duty, they have over 50,000.
Mm,
Like that's hard to think about. That's hard to think about.
yeah, yeah. Oh, and look at the artillery, right?
25,000.
God, Jesus.
I
Oh
mean, again, just wow.
like, yeah, yeah, and considering that we are now hearing with all everything that we've given Ukraine that the United States, stop sharing that, is um, running out of its Stinger and Javelin missiles and stuff. I mean, just we just don't have the industry to sustain a major armed conflict.
Nope.
We don't, and neither does Western Europe.
Neither
So,
is Western Europe.
mhm.
And
So,
and again, we don't have exact. Well, we're not looking at the exact figures, but if we go over to the Pacific, I think we're going to see similar numbers for China.
yeah,
Okay, now
yeah,
imagine a worst case scenario where we have these hot conflicts with Russia and China, which are localized to be sure. Um, they can lose a lot and still keep going. We can't.
hmm yeah, yeah. It's all about sustainment, and the Russian doctrine from World War II, with the T-34 was, I mean, it doesn't matter if it's not hyper engineered. It doesn't matter if it doesn't have an advanced sighting. It has to be good enough, and you
As
build them.
Stalin said, quantity has a quality all its own.
Yep. And warfare is the phenomenon of the mass man, for better or for worse. So, cringe. I mean, well, I mean, it is interesting to think, cringe walker. As an aside, where all the German industry is now going post Nord Stream 2 sabotage, I guess. or sabotage on YouTube, Nord Stream 2 happening. Um, when considering all of the German industry is now packing up shop and leaving for the United States, it really does make you think that the powers that be actually kind of do have some sort of nefarious plan. But to me, that just seems like, and also with the chip manufacturing in Taiwan being moved to the United States as well, that almost to me seems like too little, too late, and that the empire is contracting and leaving its satrapies out to the wind. Um,
Yeah, I agree.
anyway, all right. Well, that was a really good stream. You have anything else to say, Praise, before we go?
No, no, I think we covered all our relevant material.
Okay. Do you have any upcoming projects or things that you'd like to show?
Yeah, tomorrow night I'm gonna stream with Paul Fahrenheit and Red Hawk to talk about the Age of Exploration.
Excellent. Okay. Cool. And you can find Praise of Folly on his YouTube channel, and he also runs his Twitter profile as well. So if you'd like to get in contact with him, that's where you can find him. And of course, as always, you can find me here on my channel. I have a Gab, so if ever you lose contact, you can find me there. I'm also found on Twitter. I have my Substack, which I'm pretty prolific in writing. I have some other little projects that I've done recently. My conversations with H Hour specifically. I have an IRL friend who I have interesting conversations with, and we just decided to record them because they're just too interesting and thoughtful to not put on YouTube. And why not? So yeah, go check that stuff out if science fiction and wargaming and things like that are your cup of tea. And with that, I think we are going to end. So good night, everybody.